After studying this module, you should be able to understand the main procedure of person-centered therapy, identify 7 stages involved in the therapy, gain knowledge of the goals of the person-centered therapy, analyze the role of person-centered therapist, know about the functions of the therapist, and evaluate the changes experienced by the client. As we are aware that person-centered therapy has been referred to as client-centered therapy or the Rogerian psychotherapy, person-centered therapy has originated by Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology in the year 1940s and 1950s. It is one of the most extensively used models in mental health and psychotherapy. Rogerian therapy includes some of the fundamental concepts which are showing congruence or genuineness, empathy, and unconditional positive regard towards a client. Grounded on these features, the therapist constructs an environment which is supportive as well as non-judgmental, and thus which facilitates the clients to stretch and attain their full potential. Rogers supposed that counseling stages could be divided into 7 fundamental stages that he could perceive. He believed that these stages helped him to analyze if his clients were making any progress in therapy or whether they seemed to be caught, for a time, unable to move on. Even though the course of development can be erratic, clients do usually move in a stepwise fashion, one after the other. Roger assumed that as soon as the individual sense he or she is understood and accepted at the initial stage, then only they are able to venture to the next stage, is able to move on to the next step. Finally, it won't be wrong to say that Roger assumed that the number and nature of these processes need not be fixed. There may be more or less number of stages than 7. There are no clear-cut divisions as such. It is a continuous process which is divided into stages to understand it in simple form. Roger never said that this is the only way in which personality change occurs.
Roger believed that counseling is a process, a change, an effort, movement, or a personality change that begins when the client experiences that he is being fully received by the therapist. Rogers assumed that there were 7 stages that he may perhaps perceive, and they facilitated him to see whether his clients were progressing in the therapy or whether they give the impression to be caught and incapable to move on. Though the course of progress can be inconsistent, clients do usually progress step by step, building on their experiences at one stage before moving on to the next. Clients can move on to the next stage only when they feel that they are being understood and accepted in previous step by the therapist. The process of counseling is much complex and comprehensive as compared to the description presented in each of the 7 stages. Despite the fact that there are 7 stages in counseling process, a small number of people enter therapy at a particular stage and go on through to stage 7. Even quite a number of individuals drop out of therapy at an early stage. And if they continue in the therapy and feel it has been effective for them, then positive and meaningful change take place. Even though Roger proposed 7 stages, it is evident and clear that each individual is unique and would experience therapy in a different way, will have diverse apprehensions, and will be content to leave therapy at different times. Stage 1. During stage 1, usually the person does not know or recognize their feelings or any of the connotation that might be attached to those feelings. Clients in stage 1 is very reluctant to disclose anything about themselves. These individuals are not very open with their emotional state, with which they are not aware of or ignorant anyhow. Rogers assumed that such people will not see therapy as useful and therefore would see no value in therapy and consequently unlikely that they would take part in it. Client does not communicate himself but only communicates about externals. The person at this stage does not recognize themselves to have problem, and if they have these problems they externalize it and feel it is not to do with self. In other words, they lack self awareness. They does not like close intimate relationships with the therapist. There is no desire to change and does not communicate about themselves but only communicate about externals. There is much blockage of internal communication between self and organism. Such individuals try to deal with life in ways that turn away attention from themselves and their feelings, as they believe that if they would display their emotions, it would be considered as their shortcoming. Such individuals have very inflexible rules as to how people ought to behave, and they are overly critical of others, having a somewhat pessimistic view of human nature. Stage 2. In this stage, when the individual in the first stage believes that he is being received by the therapist, the second stage begins. In actuality, but it is very challenging to create circumstances that make him feel that he is being received. Still, the person feels problems are external to self and there is still no ownership and responsibility of the problem. Nevertheless, the person is to some point more able to express their views and feelings, possibly recognizing that they are experiencing some kind of problems. The feelings may be displayed but not accepted or have possession of. They are experienced as things of past, while people in the first stage do not willingly strive for therapy. The people in the second stage may come to the therapy. When things go wrong, they have a tendency to blame others and feel like sufferers of an unreceptive world rather than participators in it. In the therapeutic session, they come up with statements like, I am not responsible when things go wrong, am I? Or, I don't do anything wrong, other people keep creating problems for me. In this stage, at least the person recognizes that things are not as expected in their lives, but any accountability inclines to lie in others or the world in general. When things go wrong, such individuals have a tendency to blame others. People find it very problematic to agree to take any responsibility for them or what take part in their lives. Stage 3. Rogers perceives that clients are most expected to come in for counseling at this stage. There is to some extent more awareness of self here. Although a true sense of self possession still does not exist for the client in relation to their present experiences. If the experience of being fully received by the therapist is still experienced, the individual will be in the third stage. There is a free movement of expression about the self as an object which talks about feelings and personal meanings. Thoughts are still rigid, incongruency are accepted, and feelings are sometimes acknowledged and sometimes are not accepted. Personal choices are often seen as futile. People at this stage recognize that they require therapy and are willing to go in for counseling. In this stage, there may be indications that there are diverse options accessible, but there is still a disposition to see things in hard and fast terms. If they are not one thing, then they must be the contrasting. For instance, if not good, then bad. If not a success, then a failure. Client in this stage do talk about themselves, but as an object and evades discussion of present events. People are less comfortable expressing presently experienced feelings and more comfortable talking about feelings that happened in the past. Clients who first seek therapy are often at this stage and need to be fully accepted as they present themselves before moving deeper into stage 4. Stage 4. In this stage, clients come into being to define deeper feelings, usually those that happened in the past. When the client experiences the loosening with continued feeling of being understood, received, and accepted, he will be in the fourth stage. He is troubled of expressing and rather questions the validity of negative feelings. He comprehends that there is an incongruity between experience and self. The therapist is able to see that the client is beginning to accept responsibility for what is happening, even though the apprehension and desperateness of it are evident. Although there is a dread of making intimate relationship with the therapist, he risks himself and attempts to start such a relationship at least marginally. Thus, clients begin to enter into more direct relationships with their therapist, but there is often an apprehension about this. Feelings in the present start to emerge, but they are mistrusted and even rejected. Probes of this nature are quite common in therapy, and the loosening up of expression continues into the next stages. These later stages are quite intricate, and consequence of this is that the client views are expressed and experiences the world in various different ways. Stage 5. People feel free to explore their repressed or deeper feelings only when they believe that they are being fully received and accepted unconditionally for who they are and are understood by the therapist. Thus, according to Rogers, the role of the therapist is not to lead the client from one stage to the another. Nevertheless, it is to provide them with ample of opportunities to experience fully each stage in their own manner and in their own unique ways as possible. In this stage, feelings are communicated more freely, as in the present time, though there is distress of expressing such feelings. Clients are never exclusively at one stage of the process or another which can be defined easily. They may start to move on, then take a step back. In stage 5, clients feel more confident about expressing presently expressed feelings in contrast to the previous stages. Though there is a component of disbelief and fear, but seldom pleasure when the feelings which are hidden deep inside are discovered and when these feelings come out of the several personal constitutes and are discovered and critically examined by the individual. They can be a feeling of attainment of something vital but not being able to get into direct contact with it. There is still a hesitancy to trust feelings in themselves. They can be talked about but not fully experienced. New insights about life and relationships also start to materialize. They may come up with statements like, I have just comprehended something. When I start feeling uncertain of myself, I get this strange feeling inside which sort of inhibits me and stops me from being all of myself. This is happening now, but it's gradually fading. In this stage, the client is recognizing and accepting ambivalent feelings towards another person, and he is okay with having these contradictory feelings alongside each other. Contradictions and incongruence between self and organism are acknowledged and accepted. At this stage, the individual faces his problems instead of avoiding them. Responsibility for problems are held. The barriers for communication between self and organism are reduced. This process of change does not happen in few session minutes or hours but takes several weeks and months. Stage 6. Rogers designated this stage as being very distinct and time and again referred to as dramatic stage. It is categorized by feelings until that time suppressed, becoming fully experienced in the present movement. Experiencing at this stage takes on a real process quality. There is congruence between organismic experience and conscious awareness. This attentiveness is critical, clear, and full of meaning. The self, which previously has been experienced as somewhat disjointed, is now experienced as an integrated whole. Mind, body, emotion, intellect, and client experience movements of full congruence. There are no problems, external or internal. The client is leaving a problem, and the problem is no more arising and summarizing. This sixth definable point on the process of continuum is highly crucial. Here, the experience is fully in awareness, fully accepted, and the problems, if any, are dealt effectively like other clear reality. Previously felt ambiguities and uncertainties now start to fall into place and become clear. These experiences are irreversible and produce changes in attitude and perception that are quite noteworthy. Feelings start to flow freely and reach their full conclusion. Prior doubts about the prospective destructiveness of negative feelings fade away, and feelings are seen as enriching experiences, not ones to be eluded. The way the world is viewed is never the same again. One of the most remarkable findings made by many people at this stage is the realization of care, concern, and tenderness for oneself. Stage 7. Rogers thought that the changes made by clients in stage 6 have a tendency to be irreversible. This stage take place as much outside the therapeutic relationship as in it, and often reported rather than experienced in the therapeutic hour. The main feature of this therapy is that the person who reaches this stage have a new frame of mind with all their experiences. They are neither left without nor deferred. These feelings are never trusted or owned. The events and situations are experienced and understood in their newness, not as the past. The self becomes the subjective and reflexive awareness of experiencing. Now, self is not a perceived object. Internal communication is clear and accurate. The feelings and symbols are well matched. By this stage, people are effecting change for themselves, and the need for therapy is more or less over. In the therapeutic circumstances itself, client and therapist work dynamically in partnership to explore ways in which newfound confidence can be used and experienced in the world outside. Clients are open to experience, are able to trust their own feelings, and have established a strong internal locus of appraisal. There is a fluid, varying feature to life as people are able to experience each new event without being guaranteed by clarifications that belong in the past. There is a strong feeling of living fully in the present and capability to relate freely to others. An awareness that further change and growth is not only possible but anticipated. Rogers defined therapy as most efficiently taking place between stages 3 and 6. Before stage 3, maximum clients aren't agreeable to take part in therapy since they are busy attaching their problems to other people or situations. Also, initially in the progression, clients have a tendency to engage themselves in their past and external issues or people. It takes a while for people to realize their own part in their problems. Most things can't change until the client takes some ownership of the problem. All being well by the time the client moves from stage 6 to 7. The change process takes on a life of its own, and the person will continue growing even after leaving therapy. Thus, it can be concluded that in general the client owns responsibility for his problems. They live full in themselves. Now the paradigm is shifted from rigidity to flexibility, fixity to fluidity, and from stagnation to flow. The fundamental purpose of therapy is to provide a climate contributing to facilitate the individual to become a fully functioning person. Before clients are capable enough to work towards that goal, they must first get rid of the mask they wear, which they have brought about through the process of socialization. Clients come to recognize that they have lost contact with themselves by using cover ups to shield themselves from others and themselves. The goals of person centered therapy are not the same as those of traditional approaches. The person centered approach purposes in the direction of a greater amount of independence and assimilation of the individual. Their concentration is on the client as a person, not as a patient. That is why they did not use the word patient and change it to client, unlike other approaches, as they believe that both therapist and the client are equally responsible for the progress of the client. In other words, unlike other therapies, the client is himself accountable for improving his or her life. Its focus is on the person, not on the person's presenting problem. Its purpose is to help clients in their development process. The main purpose of the therapeutic process is that the therapist creates an environment for the client which is safe and caring and which helps the client to get in touch with most significant positive features of themselves that have been hidden or distorted. A reduced amount of distortion and more congruence facilitates the client to have more trust in themselves, which assists them to deal effectively with people and situations. This additional trust leads to having reduced feelings of helplessness and powerlessness, fewer behaviors driven by stereotypes, and more productive, creative, and flexible decision making. Function and role of the therapist. The role of person centered therapists is embedded in their ways of being and attitudes, not in techniques intended to get the client to do something. Fundamentally, therapists use themselves as a mechanism of change. It is the therapist's attitude and belief in the inner resources of the client that create the therapeutic climate for growth. Personal centered approach can be regarded as a way of living, a way of being, a shared journey in which counselor and client disclose their humanness and participate in a growth process. According to Rogers, the person centered therapist avoids certain functions. They generally do not take a history. They avoid asking leading and probing questions. They do not make interpretations of the client's behavior. They do not evaluate the client's ideas or plans. And they do not decide for the client about the frequency or length of the therapeutic venture. Changes in client experienced during therapy. The therapist can facilitate the client on the journey by the benefit of being generally more experienced and more psychologically mature than the client. Nevertheless, one should take into consideration the fact that both the clients and the counselor are human and can make some errors in the process of this journey. Though they both are good at what they are supposed to do, still they have some limitations. Thus, it may perhaps be too much to presume that any therapist can be genuine, concerned, and considerate at every meeting they have with their clients. But still, there is an ideal towards which he must make every effort to move. Carl Rogers has observed the following general trends which the client follows. First, moving away from cover ups. The client makes an attempt to be himself. He does not wear a mask to hide himself and avoids moving away from a self that he is not. Second, moving away from odds. The client moves away from making an attempt to be what he should ought to be according to the others. Third, moving away from meeting the expectations. During the process of the therapy, the client makes an effort to move away from what the culture presumes him to be. Fourth, moving away from pleasing people. Here, people realize that they are behaving and spending their most of the time in pleasing others, not themselves. In Rogerian counseling, they move away from this tendency. Fifth, moving towards self direction. The client now begins to move towards the course of self sufficiency. Sixth, moving towards being process. Clients appear to move in the direction of a process, fluidity, and changing towards betterment. The striving for conclusions and end states seem to diminish. Seventh, moving towards being complexity. The clients move towards becoming all of the complexity of one's changing self in each substantial movement, all the richness and complexity with nothing hidden from oneself and nothing be terrified of in oneself. 8. Moving towards openness to experience. The individual is likely to move towards living in an open, friendly, intimate relationship to his experience. 9. Moving towards acceptance of others. As soon as the capability to accept oneself is achieved, they also develop the ability to accept other individuals as they are. 10. Moving toward trust of self. The most significant predisposition the client progresses in therapy is the increasing trust in themselves.
Now let us summarize this module. Person-centered therapy has originated by Carl Rogers, one of the founders of humanistic psychology in the year 1940s and 1950s. It is one of the most extensively used models in mental health and psychotherapy. Rogerian therapy includes some of the fundamental concepts which are showing congruence or genuineness, empathy, and unconditional positive regard towards the client. It was supposed by Carl Rogers that therapy is composed of 7 steps or stages, and these stages helped him to understand if the client were progressing in the therapy or not. The therapy helped him to facilitate the process and to know whether the client was capable or not moving on to the next step of therapy and resolve their issues. Clients can move on to the next stage only when they feel that they are being understood and accepted in the previous step by the therapist. Rogers assumed that the stages between 3 and 6 are most crucial and maximum changes take place in this period. But the major problem occurs even before stage 3 starts, as the client is not very receptive to going in for therapy before that. Carl Rogers assumed that no positive change can occur unless the client takes responsibility for his or her action. Time the client does not progress from stage 6 to stage 7, after which the client will progress and grows even after they discontinue the therapy. The goals of person-centered therapy are quite unlike that were undertaken by the traditional approaches to counseling. The person-centered approach resolves in the course of a better amount of liberation and assimilation of the individual. The approach emphasizes on the client's responsibility and capability to determine ways of facing reality. Person-centered approach can be viewed as a way of life. It is a way of being. In this process, the client and counselor both mutually go through the life of the client, where client discloses their humanness and participate in a growth process. The function of the person-centered therapist is embedded in their attitude, and it is relevant in their behavior, and it helps the client to do something. Basically, it is the main purpose of the counselor to act as the agent of the change. According to Rogers, the person-centered therapist avoids certain functions like they generally do not ask any leading questions, they do not take past history, do not assess any of the client's thoughts or ideas, and do not decide for the client about the span, duration, and frequency of the therapeutic process. Rogers assumed that the therapist completely accepts the client as they are at the moment in time. Therapist places no label or name onto the client's condition. The therapist can facilitate the client on the journey by the benefit of being generally more mature and more developed psychologically than the client. Roger observed 10 general trends which takes place during the therapeutic process in the client for betterment of the individual. Rogers observed 10 general trends which take place during the therapeutic process in the client for betterment of the individual.